we have received this week and even today as we have engaged with those grassroots leaders. So they are representing that point very clearly. And again, we are in the process of bridging and creating those relationships where we can be informed by and understand that it isn't truly necessarily seats at the table. It is that power of voice in the process. And so we appreciate that. And again, we're in a learning space.
Thank you very much.
Questions from commissioners? Yes. Tracy, please.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I, too, am a graduate of Focus St. Louis. My understanding and my experience of Focus, that's been many years ago, is while there was racial diversity there, that there's a class issue as well. And so the people who were involved in the front line in many of the actions in Ferguson, though they might, it's more than just racial equity. And it's important that those voices be heard as well. I heard you speak to the racial equity lens in the board of Focus, but my question is broader than that. Have you applied that lens to your staff? And have you applied that lens to your key collaborating partners in this initiative?
Great question, Tracy. That's one of the things that we have been working on over the course of the time that we decided that we were going to apply for this. From a staff perspective, it's something that I'm constantly looking at as I'm hiring new staff members. And so when we approach moving forward with this, that's something that we will make sure that we have a very diverse staff of 4 that will be driving this initiative forward. So it's something that is top of mind. It's mindful that we're working on.
That will be in this new initiative.
That is.
I'm asking about the staff of Focus.
Yes.
I'm also asking about the staff of the St. Louis Community Foundation. I'm asking about the staff of all the key collaborative partners. Has a racial equity lens been applied to all of those partners?
And I cannot speak for St. Louis Community Foundation. I actually asked Amelia to speak in terms of her staff, but what I can say about my staff is we do have diversity on my staff in terms of racial diversity. In terms of my board, I'd like to think that my board is diverse. And as I mentioned before, that's something that on a board level, on a governance level, that we are talking about looking for ways to increase that. It's an opportunity for growth, but we do have that diversity. And Amelia?
So the St. Louis Community Foundation is committed to racial diversity. We can do better. We have about 30% of our staff is diverse, and we have diversity on our board. But I will tell you that we are very conscious, and it is part of our action plan to improve in our racial diversity.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then I'll let someone else ask. Is it possible on this organizational structure, because I am cognizant, I'm at many tables, and I'm cognizant that all tables are not equal, even when you're dealing with the same initiative. Is it possible for there to be a line at the top of this that goes from St. Louis Community Foundation across the Leadership Advisory Council to Grassroots to Focus Board of Directors?
We are open to that conversation, and part of the reason why we're having this conversation this evening is for you to provide us feedback. As we indicated, this has not been done before, so as many voices and feedback that we can get to fine-tuning what we have presented to you is going to be key for ensuring.
It would be important to me
Okay.
that the grassroots voice be at the decision-making table and not just at the implementation table.
So in terms of the Leadership Advisory Council, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying if the Leadership Advisory Council is going to be fairly representative of grassroots organizations, then perhaps that works. If not, I'd like grassroots organizations specifically identified, at least one that could be in that leadership realm, not just in the implementation of what's decided, but in the decision-making.
Absolutely. Even some of the conversations that we're having with members, leaders of the grassroots community, that is what we're proposing, that they are at that table with the Leadership Advisory Council. And they help us identify other individuals that can be at the steering committee level as well as the action teams. So it's part of our proposal here, perhaps not clearly stated, that they will be part of the Leadership Advisory Council.
And I just lied, and I'm a preacher, I shouldn't do that, but I just have one more thing, and then I'll let it go.
That's okay.
When we talked about the youth component, I heard youth in need, which I'm a big fan of youth in need, but I'm looking for something different. I'm looking for the voices of millennials who were actively involved in this change in St. Louis. I'm not just looking for organizational representation.
Right.
I'm looking for the voices of millennials who have risen as leaders in St. Louis and who push this forward. It's very different.
And we understand that. And so part of the work that we've been doing since we heard back from the External Review Committee is looking for those opportunities for introduction. And we are having those introductions, but it's just a matter of time constraints that prevent us from bringing those individuals forward. But it's something that we're mindful of, and we think it's critical to moving this initiative forward, that they are at the table.
Pat?
Yeah, just a clarification on the funding. This is all private funding, there's no public funding involved? Is that our understanding?
So some of the initial conversation that we've been having have been with national funders. And so, but we
But those are private foundations?
private foundations, correct, yes.
Okay. And who's going to go after this 1.4 million? Who's going to be knocking down the doors and asking for this money?
You're looking at her.
Okay.
In addition to other staff members who have those relationships. And, you know, certainly we're having conversations with different corporations, not just in St. Louis, but outside of St. Louis, that this is a funding priority for them. And, you know, I think we've made the statement here that although this issue right now seems to be regional, but it's actually national in scope. And so we have a lot of individuals, organizations, institutions that are looking at what's happening here in St. Louis. And that's why, you know, as we move this forward, we're looking to create a blueprint, a playbook for implementation that, God forbid, should this arise in another community, they can look at the work that we've done here and can apply it to resolving some of their issues.
If I may, the review committee gave very specific feedback about the need to have dedicated staff time towards fundraising. And in response to that, the role that we designated of the three, the resource director, that first year for the resource director will be development and solicitation of grants of a variety of kinds. So we are not closed to the concept or possibility of public funding, although the conversations that Yami has started already are with private funders. We also see that initiative director as needing to have a hand in that outreach process, because it's a lot of money to raise. And so we acknowledge that it's a significant amount and it is reasonable given the structure that we've set forth.
I appreciate that. I just want to remind everybody at the same time, Starsky's people will be knocking on our door for the Racial Equity Fund, which is separate. And that's a significant amount of money for the donors in this community. So it's not a layup, it's a three-point shot. It's my only comment. Thank you.
Yes, Scott.
Who will and how will the leadership council be selected?
So we know, it's actually a point of development still. So we know it'll be an application process, so those that are interested in throwing their hats in the ring will be welcome to do so. And beyond that, we don't have further detail to share at this time.
So will it have any accountability to the existing focus board? It seems like right now it's sitting out on an island, and I'm not quite sure how it functions.
Well, to a certain extent, the focus board will have a little bit of oversight for the Leadership Advisory Council in terms of how we've designed it. But this is a conversation that is still in process in terms of talking with our larger board on how we would proceed with this.
I would argue, I think in our observation and perhaps in your direct experience, the public will hold that group accountable and the media will help hold that group accountable. And one of the reasons to have a leadership entity that is not just our wonderful board at Focus, but is additional, is so that it can be publicly accountable in the same degree that you all have had to be.
Thank you.
Rose?
So first of all, I want to say the presentation is greatly improved from the original proposal, and I'm so appreciative because I don't think what people recognize is the short amount of time that Focus was given to move from their initial proposal to this stage. So I'm very appreciative. And my question is more about the actual mission of what you think the organization is going to accomplish. I need to know what Focus needs to be successful as the core intermediary. Because I understand that you're in the development of process with commission members, with the community, but I need to know from you as leaders of the organization, what do you need to make this core intermediary successful?
Thank you for that question, Rose. Certainly, as we've been discussing thus far this evening, we know that it's going to take really the village to make this successful, the village that being members of the community, many of which are represented in this room this evening. But certainly we recognize that we need to cast a wider net to be more inclusive in terms of individuals that and organizations and institutions that can engage in this initiative moving forward. So that, I would say, is going to be a critical piece, similar to some of the work that you've done over the past year. We also know that it's going to take staff members who will have dedicated time to working on this initiative, and that's why we've proposed 4 positions for this. But also equally important, it's going to take funding to help move this forward. And one of the things that I have to say that I'm confident about in terms of moving this initiative forward, I was sharing with someone the other day that because all eyes are on St. Louis, and part of the work that you've been doing over the past year is making the case for why this is important, that certainly the money is there. And part of what we're doing right now is making a case for how we can move forward and who needs to be at the table and the different types of financing options that are for us. So I would say those are the critical parts of moving this forward, and certainly the goodwill of the community.
Thank you.
Amy, can I ask you, I had a question when this presentation first started.
Could you get the microphone, Tracy, please? Thank you.
I had a question when the presentation first started. There was a slide that talked about what the intermediary is not. And one of the things the slide said is that Focus does not own this process. What does that mean?
So we actually took that right out of the report in terms of this is the report of the people. And our role is as convener to move this forward. And so, not to get caught up in semantics, to a certain extent, we will be part of that work moving forward. But at the end of the day, the people, the region, own the solutions because they've helped develop what the future of our region is.
If I might add, Reverend Blackman, I think one thing that we thought was very important that the commission demonstrated and that others in this process have demonstrated, it isn't so much that we don't own the process, because we are holding ourselves accountable to supporting the process, to convening the right people in the right ways to achieve action. What we were trying to be clear about was that we don't need to own the win. So this is not, as Amy said, this is not Focus's success. This would be the community's success. And so that was our intention in clarifying that, was to say that this is not and wouldn't be a focus first initiative, rather it would be a community first initiative, which is even indicative in the fact that we haven't named it. We want the community to participate in what that process might look like to name it.
I acknowledge that people hear differently, and I hear differently. What I need to know is that you believe in this work.
Oh, absolutely. You know, when I referenced it earlier, that it almost felt like a dissertation because it was difficult. It was even harder than my dissertation. And, you know, yesterday, Michelle and I were in the office working on this, and the people in our building said, geez, you must really love your job. We said, you don't say. We are committed to this initiative. We are committed to seeing it be successful, and we are committed to, in partnership with the community, working towards a vision that is very different than where we are today.
Other questions? Becky?
Yes, I just, first of all, like everyone else, thank you. You are the only one that applied, the whole group, and I think all of us are deeply appreciative of leaders. And I mean, I know that we've been in the arena for the last year, and you're stepping in potentially, and others to guide this. And so my guess is that this is just a you know, a first round of questions and a first round of thoughts and suggestions and recommendations. And so with that in mind, I'm wondering, you know, what to do with all of that, whether it's in my head or it's in the head of the rest of the commissioners and others as we leave this room. And we want to, whoever takes this task, how do we pass on, pass forth, suggest, make recommendations, be available? How do we make sure you know that we're here, not just tonight, but in the long run?
And I think that's one of the open invitations that Michelle extended when she was going over the composition of the Leadership Advisory Committee, that even though the commission sunsets December 31st, we would like to invite you to continue in this journey with us. And as we've heard from some members of the commission who have recused themselves from deliberation today, they have already raised their hand in terms of the commitment and their work with Applied Research Collaborative. And in that same manner and in that same spirit, we would like for you to continue in some capacity, understanding that you've really put a lot of work into this venture over the course of this year.
So thank you for answering to me, but I'm thinking more broadly about everyone out there and the young millennials that we're talking about, if we know them and we want to pass them along and keep us, I'm thinking about the bigger thing, not just as commissioners.
Sure.
So
And go ahead.
one thing that I would highlight is that if we were selected, we know you sunset at the end of December, and the core intermediary would sort of step forward as the leader in January. We absolutely know that in order to be successful, so back to Reverend Blackman's question of what do you need to be successful, we need to download your brains, not only the official records, but the unofficial records, what the experiences were, what you learned in that process. And we know that while we would love for the full commission to continue to be engaged, you also have, you have earned a rest. And if you would like to take the rest, we acknowledge that that is time and space that the community should give. In terms of how to get engaged with Focus, or how to contact Focus to share input, were we to be the core intermediary, I think Amy has mentioned her direct email address. We're also very active on Twitter. We would engage and welcome contact from individuals tonight. I know I have a stack of business cards with me. We want to hear from the community, and quite honestly, if a different path is taken and we hear information that would be useful, we'll be at the table in some shape or form, and we'll want to make sure that we share that. Is that getting closer? Okay.
Starsky?
I think, again, with appreciation, I've stayed out of elements of this conversation, both on the Focus side with the board and here. so most of my stuff is here on the record. I think with appreciation for the work that's been put in, I also think there have been opportunities for learning that just quite frankly haven't been leveraged. And there's a lot of stuff we won't know because it's messy. Quite frankly, at some point, the org chart we have learned will go out of the window. We had a nice clean one originally. I won't say where it is. It says draft all over it. And prayerfully it's been recycled somewhere. But I think what we're trying to get at is, it's Peter Drucker, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. What's the culture of the configuration of partners that are presented to us today? Is there a culture of shared governance which will be required for shared work in the context of the community? Is there a culture of racial equity which is different from diversity and is beyond inclusion? And there are metrics for, and quite frankly, we have heard one metric from one partner at a 30%. We've not heard metrics across the board about board members, and we have had specific questions, and these are questions that I think we can get specific answers for. And quite frankly, as an ED of a nonprofit, I know the specific answers for me, and I would imagine that others know those answers as well. Is this a culture of community organizing? Because that's what this work is. We found that from the context of our first conversations about leadership from a staffing structure, it requires community organizing. So we're looking for a culture that includes these three elements and a partner that we will hand over work that we've spent now just shy of a year on. And so I think it appropriate that commissioners have been thoughtful about their questions in as much as you've been thoughtful about the presentation. Those things, kind of broadly adaptive in mind, I want to ask some technical questions. First question, there were NAP credits that were given to the United Way or that were leveraged through the United Way for the sake of application to the work that have been cleared to leverage that, think about my friend Pat, they may kind of make him more comfortable to know that there's somewhere, like there's $250,000 out there somewhere that could be leveraged into implementation on this work. And so has there been conversation about how to leverage those, and is it more difficult to leverage those now with the configuration of partners than it would be otherwise? And I should say for the record, these are funds that we could have used that we didn't use because we saved money in our budget for all those people who were poking at our budget. I think we only spent about under $600,000 of it. So this is part of what we reserved that could be used perhaps sometime in implementation. So is that something that's just left off the table?
Which is wise, and thank you. We have no intention of leaving $250,000 on the table. And I think in the last week, we've opened up conversations with United Way, and you said that those are sort of housed at United Way right now. We have not had the specific conversation around how to access those, given the newness of reopening that conversation about partnership. In terms of ensuring that the money is used, if our structure doesn't work for that purpose, if we learn that the flexibility to allow the NAP credits to move from the United Way to the Community Foundation, that's a point at which we pivot and find a way to ensure that we're able to access that $250,000, as you said, which is a significant amount of money that you both were mindful to reserve for implementation, and we are grateful to put forward into that effort.
Michelle, really quick, I want to
Yeah.
clarify because I see Aaron Buddy in the room. Aaron, is it up to $250,000 or up to $500,000 for the NAP credits? Okay, thank you.
So it's a match. Another technical question that gets to history and culture. About 13 years ago, Focus researched and presented a report to the region on race and racism in St. Louis. Could you discuss what the organization has done to advance the findings of the report?
So since that report was issued, last year we actually revisited the report. On November 17th, we convened a group of, I would say, leaders from different organizations that were identified in that report. And we wanted to take a look at how far have we come. and what are some of the things that still need to be done with respect to that report. And so it's taken us 11 years to certainly look back at that report. And what we found is we still have some more work to do. We acknowledge that, we recognize that. And so with that in mind, we're moving forward and doing more things to ensure that there's movement in terms of what that report found at that time.
Are there ways that Focus used the report? So between that 11-year span, are there ways that Focus used the report, or the things that Focus did with the report?
So it actually became part of some of our program curriculum that, you know, we started to take a look at and do deep dives into some of those issues and around what are some areas that we can change, or whether it's you know, through creating programs in different schools, or engage in a whole slew of individuals. Also, some of our alums have taken that report further, certainly in the aftermath of the events in Ferguson. Our LSL Class 38 decided to convene a series of community conversations, of which some of the individuals in the room tonight participated, that as a way of starting positive conversation around race. We also partnered with a whole host of you know, different organizations, NCCJ, Diversity Awareness Partnership, in doing some work around that. So we've revisited that report essentially.
Got it. In the structure, you also speak to steering committees, and one of them is Youth at the Center. Was there a conversation or consideration of leveraging tables that are already set in the community? Case in point, Rated by 21 already has a multi-sector table set with some support already in the place. Is there reasoning why there would be a separate action team around youth work when there's already a community-wide table on youth work, rather than connecting that?
So there's definitely, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. I actually serve on the Leadership Council for Ready by 21, and I see some parallels along the lines of what it's in the Ford Ferguson report, and there certainly are ways in which we can collaborate in moving that forward. And as Michelle mentioned, we've already started conversations with United Way, and should we be selected, or even if we're not selected for this role, we'll continue in some capacity with that. We've been conducting interviews with a broad spectrum of organizations that are impacted by the work, and just trying to get a sense of what the continuum looks like and where gaps are. So right now, given the work that we're doing with them, I see a continuity in that, and perhaps an overlap with some of the work of the Ferguson Commission.
And that's really the logic for us behind ensuring that while steering committees are forming, we're also ensuring that the ARC and partners are engaging in that baseline assessment. So we know Ready by 21, we know some CDA movements are moving forward. There are things that Focus is aware of, or that those here in the room who are agreeing to be hopefully participate in the process would surface. And there are things we don't know about yet. And so I want to be sure that we're being clear that it is not the intention of a steering committee to be duplicative. The intention is to use the steering committees to assess the many calls to action in each of those three categories, and determine that those that have immediate political and social feasibility move forward quickly, that those that are going to take longer range planning get the resources that they need. So I think it's important, and we'll make the call again, this is another area where, to support implementation, to support the core intermediary, if you know of work going on that relates to a call to action, we need your help to surface that and make sure that we're capturing it as we do baseline assessment.
Got it. This is my last question, and I won't be like my other commissioners and have 3 last questions.
I think there were 2 commissioners at least.
I'm just saying. One of them's a preacher, the other one's a preacher's kid, so I get it. We have been really pleased with the community's response to the report. I've got a note from staff, more than 1,100 PDF downloads of the report in the last 30 days, 13,000 page views of the digital platform. We recognize that a table of 9 community organizing entities: Arch City Defenders, Missouri Jobs with Justice, Empower Missouri, Organization for Black Struggle, MORE, MCU, Students for Change, Coalition Against Police Crimes and Repression, and St. Louis Graduates got together and organized to make sure that there was a public accountability, and put more than 1,100 people in one room to talk about their 15 top kind of recommendations in the report after they assess those. We've been very glad to see people like the Regional Chamber as an organization take the report, identify their accountabilities, convene people around those tables, and to note the things that they would immediately engraft into their working operations, including making economic mobility, a goal for economic mobility for the region, a part of their strategic plan. So that is the kind of engagement that has been happening throughout the community, and that is the kind of thing that will need to continue to happen. My question with all of that kind of long runway is this: what have the institutions that are here in this collaboration, ARC, St. Louis Community Foundation, and Focus, identified in the report and taken accountability for and begun to engraft into your organizational workings today? And we note
So-
then the report findings were made available in August.
Mhm.
So that's when that community organizing table started reviewing them. And at that point, it was 200 actions, and we've seen their responses already. How have your organizations responded?
So one of the things that we've done as a leadership development program, that we've taken a look at the broad spectrum of our curriculum. We have 7 leadership programs, and as we indicated, they are issue-based focus with, depending on the program, some leadership development. And to that end, what we've done with some of our programs is focus specifically on some of these issues. So for our Leadership St. Louis program, our Class 40, one of the things that we're doing is we've earmarked a certain program day that we're going to do a deep dive into one of the issues identified by the commission. And we already know right now what are some of the areas where our membership, our Leadership St. Louis current class, is very much interested in. We also know with even some of our policy forums that we're having, some of you may know Dr. Jason Purnell. We've actually partnered with him on, looking at some of the 6 outcomes of the work that he's doing in terms of health disparities within the African American community. So we're looking at that thoroughly and looking at the broad spectrum of our programming across the board to make sure that our membership is involved in one way, shape, or form. And I'd certainly like members of the Applied Research Collaborative to talk a little bit, and also Amelia to talk a little bit about what you're doing, and maybe Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the commission, and thank you, members of the community who have taken time to come out and so passionately expressed your concerns and thoughts on this project. It's really exciting to see such an incredible room of people. I'm Kristen Wagner. I'm an assistant professor of social work at the University of Missouri St. Louis and a new member of the Applied Research Collaborative. Not so new to St. Louis and not so new to the research, but to this collaborative I am. When I joined this collaborative, one of my mantras has been knowledge is power. And as I think about research, sometimes the word research alone puts up a barrier in communities. There's research that sits on a shelf, and then there's action that happens in communities. And my approach and the approach of ARC is that research is done to build knowledge, and then that knowledge is used to inform action. So those are the reasons that I'm a part of this and that all of the members of ARC are a part of this. Before I tell you sort of my journey and the things that we do as a specific approach that I think might address potentially a missing piece of the puzzle to this conversation tonight. There's been a lot of conversation about inclusion, transformation, and what does that really look like? What's going to happen? How does that work? Research, I think, will be a really integral part of that. So I'll talk about a little bit more, but I wanted to turn to my colleague, Mark Tranel, who's actually the chair of ARC, and have him tell you just a little bit more about the body of ARC itself and some of the great successes that they've had in the past, that then why do they make a good partner for this process?
Thank you. My name is Mark Tranel. I'm Director of the Public Policy Research Center at the University of Missouri St. Louis. The Applied Research Collaborative was formed about 10 years ago to collectively respond on the part of the universities to regional needs such as this. While we are research institutions, the Applied Research Collaborative does not have a research agenda for itself. It responds to research initiatives of the community. So that's one reason why we wanted to step forward and be part of this process. But I think, Reverend Wilson, in terms of a specific answer to your question, the chancellors of the universities, as you may know, sit as ex officio members of Civic Progress, and there was a process that started actually last spring where the chancellors of the area universities appointed 4 task forces to determine what actions were appropriate on the part of the universities that ended up being in a number of areas that are in the report. So there are ongoing initiatives. I'm in particular part of an initiative to establish a social justice calendar, not just for the universities, but for the community as a communication mechanism so that the community is aware of what things are going on and that we have a way to communicate with one another. So there are a number of specific initiatives that the universities are engaged in.
And then just one final description of some of this research. So there's a number of ways that research is conducted, and many people are familiar with a lot of the databases that are out there. We use U.S. Census data quite a lot to understand social issues, social problems in communities. There are a number of us in the collaborative that are also very committed to community-based participatory research, which is maybe getting at some of the things that you're all talking about in terms of how do we hear those voices? How do we really understand what's happening, and how do we make change? So I won't belabor the term too much, but community-based participatory research is really a different approach to research, and that it's not just a researcher going out and getting subjects, and people in communities are then the subjects that are studied and reports written about them, but rather people in communities are partners in the process. So people in communities, whether it's grassroots organizations, nonprofits, fairly well-established nonprofits, churches, schools, you name it. It's those individuals who are engaged in the process from the very beginning, from identifying the questions that need to be asked, to what are the outcomes they're looking for, to who should be asking the questions, how should the questions be asked, gathering the information, and even as far then as analyzing the information and figuring out how in the world do we use this? How do we tell these stories? Who should tell these stories? And where does this go from here? How does this get implemented in terms of programming and policy action? So a number of us are engaged in that very process. It does take a long time. It takes a little bit longer. It takes a little bit more in terms of financial resources to conduct research in that way. But my experience has been that it is a much more meaningful outcome, that there is ownership of the process then, and it's people themselves that are able to then tell the story of their lived experiences and not just the researchers. So that is one of the things that we as the collaborative would commit in terms of our process and how I think it aligns with what we're doing it already in the community, but something that we would very intentionally do with this group of partners through this initiative.
May I ask you a question about that?
Yes.
Right here. Okay. We've spent quite a bit of time listening to the community. What are you going to do with the research we already have?
That's a really good question. I think I would definitely turn to our partners and say, you know, where are they in terms of looking at this information? Where are all of you in terms of how has it been parceled out? How much of it has been turned into policy recommendations or program changes in the community? And go from there. It would be a bit of a sort of that needs analysis or gaps analysis of what's been used so far and what still remains to be done in terms of utilizing that information. You've done all, I really have been impressed and in awe of your process as a commission to do the community engagement part of this, to really have the community engaged at every level. So I would want to know more about, you know, what do you see? How many people have been engaged in that process? Who's still wanting to be engaged in taking that data, that information, and then turning it into action? So there certainly would be some work to be done.
I have a question about process. While we're right there.
Did the Community Foundation answer my question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
If we could do that, and then we'll finish up questions from commissioners.
So just a few actions, I'd say that since the report released as recently as last week, and we're very appreciative to the members of the community that brought this to St. Louis. We had 5 staff at the Community Foundation attend the Annie Casey and the groups that came in to present to us about racial equity. It was very enlightening for us. We felt that we did learn a lot. And it was we walked away with focusing on intentionality and how important that is for everything we do at the Community Foundation, and specifically our own grant making, looking at and coming up with a formal process looking through a racial lens. And also developing that culture that you speak of intentionally, Starsky. We also have a number of initiatives that the Community Foundation is part of and collaborative. That is, collaboration is extremely important to the Community Foundation. St. Louis graduates, working with Scholarship Foundation and other partners, we believe that intentionality and making sure that culture of looking through those initiatives with the racial lens is important. St. Louis Invest STL, which is a relatively new initiative of the Community Foundation that is much like this, that we believe it's an initiative of the community and focused around community development. Again, I think a racial lens, equity lens can be applied. Fundraising. I want to say that the Community Foundation is committed, while I said very intentionally that we are not a fundraiser, Focus St. Louis is looking to bring in a fundraiser of which the Community Foundation will be contributing to, from our unrestricted assets to fund a portion collaboratively with others. So those are just a few examples.
Felicia, your question, please.
To process. And so you've noted that the Commission's journey to partnership with community has centered around transparency. So I'd like you to speak to community access, to what is the structure that's proposed here, how they'll get information, where it'll be, how they access it, and what is the plan to build and sustain transparency that is a hallmark of the partnership we've built.
So I'll start and let Yemi cover pieces that I might neglect. So first and foremost, we know we need to determine the future both of STL, positivechange.org, and forward through Ferguson, and how access to either of those may be permissible and what we can transfer. So that's a conversation about the information that already exists. How do we continue to make sure that there's access there? We have envisioned to date making sure that information is available online. So that's a sort of a baseline that you all as a commission have been really attentive to. So, and I think quite honestly, with those numbers that you shared, Starsky, you've had a strong response from the community accessing information through your online portals. And so that's something that we'll take in learning. We also have made sure that we have that position that focuses on making sure that we are accountable. So making sure that there is information shared on a regular basis with community. So formal quarterly reporting will be expected through the initiative director. So to the public, whether that's in person or through an online portal, is something I think that process will have to teach us, as you've allowed process to teach you. And on the commission, we will learn from that and move forward. We also are making sure that we think creatively and thoughtfully about how we reach different sectors of our community. So for some members of the community, they may not yet feel ownership over this process and moving it forward. And so how can we engage and reach them? And that might be in-person communication. So ensuring that we are out actually educating community members and engaging them and continuing the work that you all started when you released the report, making sure that you went out to tell people about the report. So that process still has life and space to move forward.
And in addition to what Michelle has indicated, we've also started conversation with individuals in the startup community to help us think creatively and innovatively in terms of how we can disseminate this information. And we recently met with one of the individuals there to help us start to think about creative ways that we can do this, understanding that there are different ways in which people receive their information, similar to some of the process that you used in figuring out how to disseminate the report. So those are things that are ongoing. We're certainly open to learning more about other ideas that members of the community may have, or for that matter, members of the Ferguson Commission may have, based on what they've learned in this process.
So thank you. We're going to transition now to Gabe. Give a last question, and then we'll move to a discussion format here, please.
Okay. My question is, and I think you guys have acknowledged it, there's been a lot of talk about the 189 calls to actions which reflect our process, but there's also the 50 signature calls to action, which were the product of a process that really kind of focused on the things that we as a group thought were the highest priority. So my question to you is, when you put up your examples, I didn't see where that played a role in the process at all. And then the other comment I heard a couple times was that the way you would prioritize which calls to action you would go after was you would kind of look at the community and see which ones were ready to go. And my comment on that is that, one thing we really were driven by as a commission is focusing on the governor's direction, that we be unflinching in our process and that we really come up with what we believed were the right solutions, no matter how difficult they look to achieve. And I think if you guys are going to really move forward as an extension of the Ferguson Commission, I think it's important that you not just become a facilitator of community action in general, but that you really focus on those signature priorities and that you not shy away from the really difficult things that we believed would be most impactful just because they're hard and they don't look like they're ready, the community's ready to move on it. As I see it, the uniqueness of the Ferguson Commission is that we're going after the hard issues, and I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
So the two that we focused on in our presentation tonight were two that were identified and selected. And we drilled that down to the CDA example that Michelle shared with you. So we could have picked any number of them, but we chose to focus on that.
The review committee actually asked us to focus on
that.
Those were two of the signature priorities.
Yes, that was determined by them.
If I may, I believe I conflated when speaking, possibly with attention to time and possibly just in the fluster of being in front of all of you, both the term calls to action and signature priority areas. So we are keenly aware of the work that was done to identify and prioritize those as significant and needing immediate attention. So when we say what moves forward in terms of action teams, we know there are short, mid, and long-term commitments in terms of what it will take to move things forward in our community. I think we heard earlier from State Representative some of those issues that relate to state-level governance change require sometimes a longer-term or longer vision process than some that require local community change. And so we are aware of that, and I think if I conflated the terms, that was in my error. I also want to just point out, and Amy may want to add additional clarity here, it wouldn't be Focus that is going through and saying of the signature priority areas and the calls to action that are found in the Opportunity to Thrive category. These are the 7 that should move forward in the next quarter. These are the 10 that should move forward in the next year, and these are the 3 that are multi-year commitments. Rather, we're relying on the steering committee of experts, so people who know what's going on in the field, who also have a sensitivity to not only what is most plausible right now, but what is most necessary. And so that is, that commitment would be coming from that steering committee of experts, not from the Focus staff.
I'd like to build on, as a wrap-up here, that comment, not necessarily for a response, because I think you did provide a response. And I think what you're sensing around this table and what you've heard in the public comment is just the deep care and how important these issues are and how the work that we've all done together over the last year has been. And so as we now think about how we hand that off, you're hearing that concern and that care come through, because we feel like we've learned a lot and we desperately want to transfer that and be involved in that going forward. And so that's what you're hearing, and you're being responsive to that. And I think I've heard here, and certainly I would reinforce from my personal perspective, is that we did develop the signature calls to action in the priority areas and the racial equity umbrella with a great deal of thought. And my own personal perspective is you don't need to go back there. We've done a very open, transparent, inclusive process. And so if at the extreme, a steering committee were to say, we don't like any of the signature priorities, we've got, 3 more that we want to add or 4 that were down the list, I think Focus and others, but Focus have got to call back and say, wait a minute, that's not what we're here for. Let's go back to the table and let's look at the signature priorities, because those were identified with an extensive experience of community input and prioritization. And so in one sense, we feel like we've done that work, and that it's important that that work be continued, first of all, in terms of the discipline of that, but secondly, with the sense of urgency that we've developed. And we have seen it as part of our role with public officials and with accountable bodies and others to keep a sense of urgency and questions, and literally probably almost not a day goes by that many on the commission are involved with talking to folks saying, what are you doing? What's behind the questions that Starsky asked earlier? And so that needs to be picked up with the same sense of urgency, if not a greater sense of urgency of the momentum. And to your credit, bringing people to the table and will yield that sense of urgency unless they're allowed to churn and allowed to just kind of talk about the issues and talk about the problems that are occurring in their box as opposed to coming together. And so we can try to make that as easy as possible in terms of transferring everything we've learned. We do know that we can transfer the website and all of the technology behind that so that the iterations we've gone through, from what we built on the very basic level to what we think is really a differentiating ability to keep people engaged in the process through the through Ferguson.org site. And so that would be a tool available to whoever is selected, if you all are, as the core intermediary. And I think the final thing I would say is that the Higher Education Collaborative that was referred to earlier, and Bethany and Starsky and Rose and I met with the chancellors and the provost representatives that were there some time ago, and we heard their response. And it was interesting, but there was frankly not a sense of urgency behind that. And I think that's and there were good priorities and I think appropriate priorities in some cases in that. But yeah, I think we rely on representatives of the community, in this case Focus and others, to keep the pressure on, particularly with the partners that are at the table, to be engaged all across the board. So those, as I say, don't necessarily require comment. I wanted just to, in some ways, kind of build on several comments that were here, and particularly the last 2 or 3 that were made. Any last minute, absolutely burning, got to have an answer questions from the commission? Okay, we're going to thank you all for being very open and candid.
Thank you so much for the time. And thank you all for your questions as well. They were very thorough.
You're welcome. Okay, we're going to open the floor for some commission discussion now. Rose has been preparing to think about a motion that would get this on the table, and so I think that would perhaps help frame the discussion that we would have. So, Rose, if you would, please.
In the interest of brevity, I'm not going to try to add all the provisions to this motion that I heard around the table. So, but for discussion purposes, I would like to make the following motion. I move Focus St. Louis's proposal forward as the core intermediary with the following provisions. 1, that the core intermediary's leadership and decision-making table must include grassroots organizations, millennials, and protester organizations. And 2, the racial equity lens must be applied intentionally and internally to all individuals and organizations working in association with the core intermediary.
Okay, you have a motion which needs a second to be on the table, and then we'll discuss amendments or changes.
I'll second.
Second to the motion. Okay, so discussion or questions or changes?
Hi, Mr. Co-Chair.
Yes.
So one of the biggest lessons that I've learned this year was a deeply personal one, because even as an African-American woman, someone who's been engaged in the protest movement, I still myself possess a lot of privilege. And I lead a nonprofit that has a lot of privilege. And I think it's one thing to set an agenda and invite other people to engage in the way that we dictate. It's another thing to set a plan or a design in motion with the people that are most affected. And so I think the hesitation that I'm feeling is that what we see here is a plan that was done in a really short amount of time that, as we've heard, has been acknowledged, has never been done before. And some of the anxiety that I'm hearing reflected in questions from the commissioners and the community is that it doesn't feel like there's been enough time to create something that is truly inclusive from the very beginning. There are still for me too many unanswered questions about how we are going to ensure not just inclusiveness and not just diversity, but to Reverend Wilson's point, equity on all levels. And I don't want to make a decision just because we're running out of time. Like, I don't think that that would be respectful to the process that we've engaged in for the last year. I don't think it would be respectful to all the many people from around this community that have committed time and time again to come and bring their ideas. And so I am wondering if there can be some kind of even more provisional approval than this, such that Focus and other involved organizations actually sit down at this phase and engage in some kind of redesign, perhaps with organizations that have already been referenced and individuals that need to be included, Jobs with Justice, MCU, OBS, more, et cetera, such that what we're building from the ground up is already inclusive versus saying, we built an agenda, please come to our table. I don't think that that was the intention. I think it was because we have so little time. That's how it, like, for efficiency's sake, that's how it happened. And I'm worried, and I feel a lot of anxiety, and I'm getting messages about people's anxiety because it feels rushed and it feels like those voices haven't been included from the very beginning. So I suggested a different kind of provisional approval.
Starsky.
I won't get to vote, so I just talk. So with this provision, it's something that works in me. I have the same kind of concern about the inclusion, the first provision about the inclusion on the leadership table. I would suggest if there were redesign, what would make me more comfortable is to have an institutional partner as we have this configuration of 3, that there should be a grassroots partner. Quite frankly, I think for the sake of the capacity that's required to actually keep this going, you don't need grassroots people at the table, you need a grassroots partner that is a part of the configuration and design. So I offer that in conversation. I don't know if that's, quite frankly, I don't know if that fits with the motion because you can't get that now. That may fit with some broader time frame that gives opportunity for redesign, that be centered.
I got a question.
Byron?
Just a quick question, somewhat of an emotional question. I'm physically drained and emotionally drained from some things in my personal life going on right now. I don't know how much more energy I'm going to have personally to persevere further than December. However, I still feel that almost like my firstborn that I'm getting ready to give away here. And I want to make sure that we have some members of our commission involved in this, because I know if you guys are involved in this, I know it's going to have the fire it's going to need. And I don't want us to go into the sunset on 31st of December and turn this over without members of this commission who have sweated and been at all of these meetings, and we've had all kinds of turmoil that we've had to go through. I trust this commission like I trust my family. And if we've got family member on this commission that you guys are going to have, I would feel so much better, because then I know you're going to have the fire, because these 16 or 15 people that I'm here with, I'd go to war with them anywhere, because these are some fighters. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Tracy?
I feel emotionally pulled. And I don't think it's just emotion. I think it is also my warning signals going up. So I'm just going to say this. Tonight, I cannot support this. And the main reason I can't is because the vast majority of the partners that I've heard were already in play before August 9th, and yet we're here. And so I have great concern about passing off this to those who have already been doing, quote unquote, the work prior to August 9th and expecting a different result. I need the configuration to look differently. I said that when I spoke earlier. I need the grassroots to be on equal par with everyone else. I need to see millennials on equal par, because other than that, we've had all of these players in motion in St. Louis for a very long time, and it didn't make a difference. What made a difference in these last 400 plus days are the people who have not heard mentioned significantly tonight. And I cannot, with good conscience, support that.
Felicia?
I feel torn. I know I don't get to vote, and it's important it's important that everyone know that I have been recused from this process on both sides of the process. So other than attending the public hearing, because I am a member of the public, and then having this opportunity to read this and listen to questions, I haven't had time as a commissioner to be engaged and be reflective. And I know I don't get to vote, but I would like to have an opportunity, whether I get to vote or not, to talk with other commissioners about stepping forward with what they've seen and what they've stated that they need. It's important to me that that gets cleared up in a more confirmed way.
So
That might
let
be
me,
selfish, but I haven't had time to deal with it.
yeah, thank you for the comments. Let me try to build on two or three that I've heard and see if we can get to a place where we can move this forward. And if we cannot, then we cannot, but we ought to keep at this for a bit. So the first proviso about leadership and decision, there were groups listed. If that proviso is amended to say, to ask Focus as a core intermediary to develop a grassroots partnership based on continued conversations and commitments, and to work with our staff in that process so that the Commission's viewpoints are represented through our staff process, that is a provision added to the motion in a provisional approval, and we can ask our staff to come back to us and say, here is what the design has been redone based upon that grassroots partnership. And then we have the option as a commission to call for a more deeper review, if we wish, at our final meeting, or to do an open public phone call or whatever we can or need to do in order to process that if any commissioner says this is not adequate, or any group of commissioners. I'm mindful of, we want to do this right, Byron, building on your comment, and that we are at a critical point in the process. I'm also mindful of the fact that we do need to keep this process moving and that we need to make decisions. Bethany frequently reminds us that December 31st is approaching, and we need to give our core intermediary partner the time to do this as best they can while we are still available to them as a body. To build on Byron's comment, I think that Focus has indicated they clearly intend to involve commissioners in the Leadership Council. What that looks like, I understand, cannot be determined. Individual commissioners, don't know. And they need to look at how that fits into a larger group. So to a certain extent, we've got a bit of a leap of faith on that point. But I think if I hear comments regarding grassroots partnership very deeply felt around this table. And so if we put that specific proviso as a condition that a grassroots partner be developed as part of your first statement, subject to review with the staff and then briefing with the commission and memos that are public and open and transparent, and then perhaps a community input process, then that we come back to that as a commission if anyone is not comfortable with it at that time.
Can I, just a question for clarification. Are you saying to establish a grassroots organization in this existing structure, or are you saying establish a grassroots partnership to go and help redesign this, and then we come back together and evaluate the redesign?
That the leadership structure be designed in concert with a grassroots partner. And so they have a design, but that they go to the grassroots partner to determine how to amend or change that design, and then come back to us to talk about that.
Thanks for clarifying.
So I want to make sure I'm clear. Are you also noting that that grassroots partner not only would be a part of the discussions about design, but would be a part of the final product?
Right.
Right. I think that's where the motion says that a grassroots partner is in the design.
Okay.
Do we know how we define grassroots? Yeah, I don't know what that means.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would offer this. A staffed advocacy and community organizing entity. And for me, that could be, quite frankly, 501c3 or 501c4. That may add additional complications for others. But I think with full-time staff is a critical element for the sake of parity and conversation. I think a missional commitment to strategies of advocacy and community organizing are what we're talking about, or at least what I think of when I say that.
Right. Okay.
I know I can't vote as well with Felicia, but all of these are, of course, very, very valid concerns, and I'm wondering if there can't be some kind of leadership transition where a period of time, a number of people on the Ferguson Commission will serve on the leadership commission of whatever entity Focus St. Louis establishes. So we'll have some continuity in the transition from the commission to this new entity. I think that's very important. It seems that just sunsetting the commission and a completely new leadership structure coming into being is not really realistic, and there needs to be some transition period, and so maybe that could be worked into the recommendation, that there will be some number of commission members who will serve a period of time in helping to develop and transition the knowledge that we have into this new entity. Recognizing that at some point it will not be the same makeup, and I think all of us agree it should not be the same makeup as the commission, but there should be some kind of transition period for us to just drop our activities on December 31st and believe that this new entity can pick up after we've gone through this process for 12 months. I don't think it's fair, and I don't really think it's realistic.
So let me ask others on the commission, is there a sense that we should identify a number of commissioners, as Dan has suggested, to be a part of this leadership council? Or do you want to leave it open? Just quick around the table feedback.
Perhaps just a minimum.
And do you have a minimum in mind?
Not that I can defend right this second. 3, 4, 5.
A fourth of the commission.
I hear, we got math going on around the table. I hear 4, I hear 5.
So
You know, I'm mindful that the Leadership Council is in formation, and perhaps, Dan, in your comment, it was a transitional comment. So, you know, I'm mindful of not putting something in granite, you know, that can't be changed at some point down the road. So, if the sense of the group is a minimum of, pick a number, 4, or other numbers that somebody would suggest, and that be a transitional number for, pick a time, a year, 12 months, to support the work of the core intermediary.
if I could offer a bit of something a little different, but rather a ratio, because we don't know.
Yeah, how big it will be.
So perhaps it's a third. I would offer something like that, which would make it 5, but I would also suggest expanding the group beyond the commissioners to also be to include the commission staff. That there's a reservoir of knowledge that could be leveraged, that also, from a day-to-day perspective from the staff, that may make it more palatable to get to 5.
Good thought. So the thought, as opposed to an absolute number, is to suggest that a third of the council, however formed, for a year be made up of Ferguson commissioners or commission staff. That's your thought? Okay, reactions around the table?
I could agree with that.
Okay, we got nodded heads. Okay.
Can I speak right there? So,
Yes.
One, I want to be very clear that we have a December 14th meeting with which we have an opportunity to work at the behest of the commission with what we've heard tonight and continue to evolve things. So we have opportunity to do that. I think that speaks to some of the antsiness going on. Second, in terms of the next year of commitment, I have to be very honest in that my contract ends 12/31 as a loaned executive with the Ferguson Commission. I have committed to the IHN that I have to be in my position serving there by February 1 through the following year. So I am willing and available, of course, because this is critical work, but I have to really guard my time because of my commitments that I've made in 2016 to doing this. So I know I'm a key aspect of this and just want to go on the record saying how critical it is, and I'm loaned, and I have to be thoughtful about that.
Thank you for that clarification.
So I just wanted to clarify what I heard put together, and maybe this is motion language, but I'm not really good at that. So, but what I heard was to reconvene December 14th, to seek approval for a core intermediary plan that would and between now and December 14th, the following would happen. That one, a grassroots partnership as defined by Pastor Starsky would be established at the leadership level. That two, and I don't think this was, I think we referred to this, but we didn't mention it explicitly because there were lots of questions asked tonight that weren't included in the original application process. So there needs to be some way that we codify what those questions and evaluation criteria are that we heard throughout the room tonight, so that when the redesign happens, there's some clarity as to what people are redesigning toward. And so then three, that redesign happens with the engagement of that grassroots partner, and that grassroots partner would continue on equal footing as a partner in the actual plan that's submitted. And then that meeting would happen on December 14th. And also in that plan would be a third of this Leadership Advisory Council would be expected to be commissioners or commission staff. That's what I heard / want to make sure is on the record.
Yeah. My thought would be that we provide provisional approval for Focus as the core intermediary with those conditions, that the grassroots partner at the leadership level to be involved in the redesign with a third of the commissioners represented on the ultimate in the design. But I think we need to say to them tonight, either you have approval to move ahead and do this redesign, or not, but subject to that. I think they're hearing clearly what we have in mind and what they're hearing around the table. So, Bethany, if you're comfortable waiting until the 14th to finalize this, we can do that. I was trying to move it more rapidly, realizing the December 31st is coming, but we can do it in multiple ways.
It's helpful to get, because we are transparent, we've talked about that, it would be helpful to get provisional approval for us to work together so that we can do this additional work. I'd also add that I think a fundraising strategy, more detail with that is also a really major concern that I heard that we should also be working on.
So I have 4 provisos to the motion, right? That
Rich, can I ask a question? before-
Certainly, yes.
Is approval needed for you all to work together?
That's my question also. It has been our way to make sure that there's transparency, that everyone knows what we're doing, what we're saying, and how we're convening. So we, with intent, even having one proposal, did not engage with Focus until we got the public meeting with the RFQ process in the way that provided a green light for today. So it's good for us to get an action that's specific about what is it that we need to be accomplishing by 12/14, so we make sure we hit that on 12/14.
I understand that. My question is provisional approval necessary for that?
I don't really care what you call it.
I think what she's saying is, can we approve those 4 actions without provisionally approving this plan? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
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 So it sounds like what, so I'm just taking a shot here. Perhaps it's still a motion, but it sounds like it has, elements of it have changed to be a motion to direct staff to work with Focus to develop a partnership that includes these 4 items. So it's not as much an approval of what has been presented to us, but a directive to staff to work with Focus to develop something that includes these elements, because in some ways this could fundamentally change what has been presented if we're talking about a different institutional partner.
Yeah, I understand that and agree with the 4 provisions. I think we need to say to Focus, you know, you have our approval to go work with staff for these changes, and if these changes are made, then we will select you as the core intermediary. So we may be at semantics, but.
Well, I think respectfully, I don't think it's semantics. I think the elemental difference is it puts the grassroots partner on unequal footing with Focus. And that's the equity conversation suggests that they need to be an equal partner in conversation. So Focus, East West Gateway, who's not at the table now, Community Foundation and ARC have been partners up to this point. So if you approve this and then push someone else for them to add, that person is an addendum, not an equal partner. And so what we're asking for is equity in the construction such that it may look differently when you add something. And so that will require us to allow staff the directive to work with everybody and to find the right person. Otherwise, we quite frankly put that partner on unequal footing. They got to do what Focus says to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I didn't interpret it that way.
I'm not suggesting there was an interpretation.
Yeah.
I'm actually interpreting the implications of the
words provisional approval.
No,
Yeah.
of approving Focus. That's why I talked about the reorientation of the motion. The motion is now directed to staff, not to Focus. Focus is an applicant like they were when they came in here, and they are directed to work with staff to figure out another appropriate applicant, such that they don't have any other standing of any other nonprofit or any other organizations that are already doing work around our work. They got to come back and they got to figure out who they're going to truly partner with, not who they're going to pick.
So we need an alternative motion if that's going to be the case, or we give Rose?
So I have to ask, am I withdrawing my motion and offering a new motion, or is it an amended motion? Okay.
You're the maker, so you need to withdraw the motion and make a new one.
Okay, so
Or
I'm
amend it.
withdrawing my original motion, and I actually need the language, unless you'd like to offer the motion that we just agreed on, because I don't have it written down.
Bethany, you want to try language?
David, thank you.
Well, that was in Rose's initial motion.
So the language here is approval of motion to staff to plan with focus to reconvene during the December 14th commission meeting to seek approval for the core intermediary plan that, one, grassroots partnerships as defined would be established at the leadership level, two, codify the questions and answers that were communicated as part of that plan, three, redesign what happens with grassroots partners on equal footing as an equal partner, and number four, a third of, that incorporates that the advisory committee is composed of commissioners or staff, and the fifth would be the financial development of the fundraising strategy as well.
I so move.
So motion and a second. So we have any further discussion? Okay, I think we have 9 people who can vote. Is that right? So I'm going to suggest we do this by a roll call vote so that it's clear who's voting and who's not. Can you do that?
I can. I can do three things, but.
No, not that one.
Okay, roll call. Also, I'm going to do all names, and you can call out your abstention as well. Reverend Starsky Wilson.
Abstain.
Rich McClure.
Aye.
Kevin Albrand is not with us. Rasheen Aldridge is not with us. Pastor Tracy Blackman. Aye. Okay. T.R. Carr.
Abstain.
Gabe Gore. Aye. Becky James Hatter. Daniel Isom.
Abstain.
Scott Negwer.
Aye.
Brittany Packnett.
Aye.
Felicia Pulliam.
Abstain.
Pat Sly.
Aye.
Byron Watson.
Aye.
Rose Windmiller.
Aye.
1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9 ayes. 4 abstentions.
Okay, motion passes. We will get the motion typed up and cleaned up and posted on the website. Okay, we're ready to move to Commission Planning Administration. Managing Director.
Right, great. At this time, Serena Mohammed, if you are, yes, you're still, yes. In the room, we're going to set up, we had talked about earlier in the meeting, for those of you that were able to attend. P.S. There are some snacks and some beverages that are outside if community or petitioners want to grab that. To talk about the evaluation and monitoring approach, you will note that originally in our September meeting, with the time frame that we had, we were attempting to engage within the governmental process, because we are a governmental entity, to have to design and develop an RFQ to release for this evaluation and monitoring role. Since that time, and given the process, the intensive process needed for the core intermediary, there's a 3-week minimum requirement to develop and design the RFQ or the RFP for the state, meaning that even if we design that RFQ, posted that, got the feedback back, there isn't sufficient time through December 31 to actually get on the ground to do that work. So instead of that approach, with the time we have remaining, we are working actively with Serena Mohammed, loaned to us by the St. Louis Mental Health Board, to talk about and refine this evaluation and monitoring approach, with which during this same time frame between now and December 14th, we would also like to engage with Focus St. Louis and its partners to talk more deeply as well. Serena, with that, if you would walk through this slide. Thank you so much for coming.
Sure, and it's going to be pretty brief because most of the content is explained pretty well on the slide. I think the thing that's significant to note is in earlier presentations, we've talked about the leadership role and the core intermediary role as being kind of the focus of backbone support for collective impact. One of the things that this evaluation and monitoring role does is it brings the expertise and practical application. So we've learned that collective impact is relatively new. The ability to apply a racial equity lens to the work is even newer. and we need assistance in the region in making sure that we're doing this in the best way possible. So when you look at the evaluation and monitoring, for those who are familiar with developmental evaluation, this is essentially a developmental evaluation framework. And what that does is it looks at how are we actually engaging people, how are we making sure that there is equity in the process and that there are shared power and decision-making avenues. So all of those issues around public accountability and public engagement are wrapped into the evaluation and monitoring function, and that there's continuous learning and process improvement. So acknowledging that most of us are very new to this work and that it's something that we're learning as we're doing, that there are external experts across the country who are proficient in movement building, who are proficient in collective impact, and who know how to apply the racial equity lens, that can actually come in and look at our process and identify areas for improvement. So this is not necessarily measuring the impact of the individual calls to action, but it's measuring engagement strategy. It's measuring who's at the table and who's not at the table, and actually helping to develop strategies to get the right people in the room. So it should address some of the issues that have come up in the gaps that exist in the existing proposal, especially around applying the racial equity lens. There was a conference last week that was hosted by PolicyLink, the Racial Equity Summit, where they talked a lot about this new application of racial equity to collective impact. And a lot of the conversation was about identifying how to reach out to existing groups so that we're not asking them to be integrated into a process that exists, but that we're figuring out how to sit at different tables that are already present within the community. So I think a lot of the work that's happening nationally speaks to some of the concerns that have been raised so far this evening. And hopefully if we're able to get this evaluation and monitoring piece plugged in over the next few weeks, you might be able to see some of that inform the new structure going forward. And then integrating culturally relevant methods. And the idea here is there was some kind of mixing of terms between equity, inclusion, and diversity, and being very intentional in understanding how to make sure that there's an equitable table. It's not just about the number or types of people in the room, but how decisions are made, how people are engaged, how communities are empowered. All of that is a part of the evaluation and monitoring piece. So it's different than the local evaluation, but it is connected in that they will be looking at the same shared measurement. So it's not just evaluation for the sake of evaluation. They're going to look at when you have a racial equity lens in place and you're mobilizing community and the right people are engaged, are you actually able to have better or greater impact? So the end result is, are you able to actually achieve the calls to action because you're doing work differently than you might have done in the past? So that's the purpose of the monitoring and evaluation piece, and it should support the leadership structure as well as the core intermediary structure. So, questions about that? Okay, thanks.
So Serena, this is a very helpful resource. You've heard the presentation from Focus. Could you just, I know you hit on this very briefly, just clarify just with a little bit, another paragraph or two, how this is different from the evaluation process that Focus had in mind for the applied partner, or how it dovetails or conflicts?
It's very different, but it's complementary. So developmental evaluation is actually evaluating the process for engaging community and the process for making sure that there's equity and the process for making sure that there's shared power. So an example of that would be, let's say that they're looking at a specific calls to action and they have a strategy on who needs to be at the table and how they're going to move this call to action forward. Your developmental evaluation piece would look at whether or not the right people are in the room, whether or not the decision-making process is structured in a way where people have equal input into decisions that are made, and whether or not by adjusting the way that the work is accomplished, you're actually able to address disproportionate impact of policies. So whereas the local evaluation team might be looking at data on a specific issue, the developmental evaluation piece will help to disaggregate that data and to determine whether or not the specific methods that are being used impact different groups or subgroups in a different way. And then they would also be able to offer specific technical assistance on what the core intermediary can do to make sure that they are addressing issues of disproportionality in any of the policies that are being proposed. So it's a little deeper dive to make sure that the equity work is actually
taking place in the way that has been proven to work across the country, using some of these tools that exist. So I think the thing that seems complicated is because it's relatively new for our region, and it is relatively new in general, but there are people who are doing this work. There are people who have been successful using these tools and these models that can help inform the way we proceed locally.
Thank you. That's helpful. Other questions from commissioners? Okay. Thank you very much, Serena. Bethany, we have approval of the, oh, we have Starsky on the Racial Equity Fund, please. There's a slide deck.
Because it seems like more fun over here, I'm going to come over here. I'll be brief. There are, I think, 4 slides that we're seeking to cover. The response is to the call to action. One of our overarching calls to action in the report is for the establishment, or to read directly from the report, the creation of a 25-year managed fund to solely support regional racial equity infrastructure for all sectors. Funding for racial equity capacity, needs, and training assessment, analysis, implementation, impact, sustained strategies, and accountability. The accountable bodies that were named were the Arts and Education Council, the City of St. Louis, Civic Progress, the Community Foundation, Gateway Center for Giving, the Health Departments, the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, the Missouri Humanities Council, the Regional Arts Commission, the St. Louis County, St. Louis Economic Development Partnership, St. Louis Regional Chamber, and the United Way. What you'll see on these 4 slides is a proposal that has been workshopped in draft form. So we know it doesn't say draft here, it's been drafted everywhere else. So just imagine the word draft going across it, because we recognize this has to be an outworking of these engaged partners. We are appreciative to a group of funders that met on last week. As has been noted before in the racial equity training, 30 funders gave additional input to develop these ideas and approaches. And then on Friday, we were able to have further discussion with representatives from Civic Progress and the Regional Business Council firms who were gathered to consider updates to the commission's work as well. So we're able to share this with them. So a couple of things noted here. 25-year managed fund, ultimately probably the easiest way to think about that is resources that have been placed in the same place for the sake of being endowed, and having the opportunity to then set off or spin off a percentage of those endowed funds to support this infrastructure in a perpetuated manner in an ongoing basis. Housed neutrally, so this should be at a space and place that is mutually agreeable to the partners who are investing and is accountable to the community. One of the examples of an opportunity of a place like that is the St. Louis Community Foundation. Others could be places like the United Way. Could be held in several different entities in our community, but should be a place that is neutral. An important one that I'll read, I don't like reading slides to people directly, but I'll read the full language here. Allocation decisions should be made by a panel of community members reflective of the demographic diversity of the region and weighted for corrective purposes toward people affected by the region's history of racial segregation and inequity. Meaning that it is inappropriate, quite frankly, that if the community were 50-50, black and white, and I know that's too clean, that we're not that clean, you know, that kind of thing. But the history of the oppressions were felt by black people, then it's not appropriate to have a 50-50 allocation panel that's black and white. You should actually be weighted more among those who have experienced the disparity. Or if our region, however we define it, is 13% of one particular racial group, then 13% is not necessarily appropriate here. It actually should be higher for weighted purposes. So these are kind of core elements that we note across the fund. What would it fund? What are the kind of broad categories? There are 3 that have been noted here that could be funded as broad categories as racial equity infrastructure as aligned with the call to action. The first, of course, is pursuit of implementation of the Ford through Ferguson policy recommendations. Here you see things like multi-year general operating support for the core intermediary, support for third-party evaluation and measurement, which you've heard spoken of, multi-year support for multi-sector networks to advance themes of the report. One of the things we noted, we talked about Ready by 21 already being in place, but is there a multi-sector network around justice for all? Once this group goes away, probably not. So there may need to be support, additional support there to help that work get started, which would support the work of the core intermediary. And then finally, multi-year support for legislative education, voter education as necessary, and community mobilization. This is something that could be contracted through because it would need to work with, of course, the core intermediary. But part of our concern, as a matter of fact, as we went through the core intermediary process, is we began to assess what are some of the reasons why an entity wouldn't want to apply for this work. And some of it is there's no resources anywhere for this work. So we began to construct and say, we want to be able to get the best partners, so we need to be able to put a support in place for this. So we believe this is one of the things that could be a core area of funding. Second, as our working group around diversity, equity, and inclusion informed for us as they worked around this table with us that there are capacity needs there as well. We also had the opportunity to have some back and forth with funders in the community who noted some of the things they'd like to see from these organizations that do work in DEI space, like Diversity Awareness Partnership, NCCJ, and others. And so part of what is proposed here is a staffed cohort model for organizational capacity building among those entities. What would it mean to take those entities and rebuild their capacity by investing in leadership, strategy development, to make those institutions stronger for our community, not to just give program support, not to write a blank check, but to actually build capacity by building a community of learners together and by undergirding those institutions and organizations with this kind of strategic philanthropic approach. So here you see organizational capacity building for DEI organizations in the region. We should note that as we had conversation about this, we had at least one table of funders that said to us, yes, we may need to build capacity among these organizations, but we may also need additional capacity in the region. They pointed to an initiative in Boston called FinCom, or the Finance Commission, that is an independent watchdog entity that actually takes legislation that is proposed in the public space in the city and runs it through a bit of a racial equity lens. It assesses for disparate impact, and that becomes part of the infrastructure for policy making in the city of Boston. So this could be tweaked, of course. These are not, this is not set in stone because y'all still imagining the word draft, right? Draft, okay. All right, last area, last slide, is a consideration of network building for civic engagement and community organizing organizations. We note that the statewide table of community organizers here in this region is A, underfunded by local funders. Much of the funding for our capacity for critical fights that we've had for policy change in our region, including Medicaid expansion, has been largely funded by people from places like New York and California. And so some of these organizations went through a 6-month assessment with the Wellstone Institute about how they might work together. So this isn't funding necessarily for an individual institution, but it helps them to assess how can you leverage communications capacity, how can you build shared database, shared infrastructure to move issues of policy together on the unique political landscape that we have in the state of Missouri. And so because they've gone through that assessment, there's data already there to say that part of what we can work with those organizations is to help them work together in order to leverage one another's capacity. So distinction from before, where you're talking about building the organizational capacity of a particular set of organizations, here you're talking about building the network capacity, the capacity to work together and advance aims among these civic engagement and community organizing entities. I believe that's the last slide. That's the last slide I had. Questions about those things? I don't know how to make it go backwards, so I would need David or somebody over there who really, you know, David always has the answer.
What type of funding level would you anticipate needing to make it effective?
This was a good question. I was pushed out on the first group of funders to consider this, and this is what I said to the second group. First, no, the first group was helping me prepare for the second group, so I just said, whatever number I say is probably going to be too low first. Second, this is what I did. I did back of the napkin calculations. Back of the napkin, and so let me say this to those who have applied to be the core intermediary. This is not meant to take away the full burden of fundraising for the core intermediary, because we made that a core capacity, but it is to try to relieve it a bit. And so So what I said was I, on the back of my napkin, could account for about $40 million in announcements of funding that were responsive to Ferguson over the course of the last 12 months. Most of it is programmatic funding, not policy funding, and that's what we're calling for. We have to continue to remind people these are 189 policy recommendations, not recommendations for new program support, right? But what I suggested is if that $40 million had been placed in the managed fund, then it would produce on average about 5% distribution rate from, using the models of a private foundation. That'd be $2 million a year perpetuated over 25 years that we could invest in this kind of work, right? And so at that, based on the funding proposals that we've seen from the core intermediary, you could do in the models that I know of, staff cohort models for organizational capacity building. I know Deaconess knows a little bit about that piece. We've been doing it for about 10 years. I would suggest that you could probably fund about a third of the annual budget of what we're seeing from the core intermediary with that amount and still have enough to make substantive investments in the organizational capacity and the network capacity building work with about $2 million a year at a $40 million managed fund. So you probably, this grows, right? So you start getting more people around the table. There are more things that likely need to be supported in the funding. You do something like the Finance Commission, then you got to build out a new entity there. So I think the starting place is $40 to $50 million. But again, I say, we have, without a coordinated strategy in independent silos, announced $40 million in the last 12 months without a coordinated strategy. And I want to argue these strategies are also informed by places like the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy and grant makers for effective organizations. These are best practice investments for effective philanthropy. And one of the things we know, and yes, I have my bias, so I own that. One of the things that we know is that you have leveraged investments. There was a report called Leveraging Limited Dollars by the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy that suggests for every $1 you invest in community engaged strategies, capacity building, organizing, advocacy work, so that you make policy change, you actually get a $115 return in public benefit. So these $40 million that have been invested in counting the number of heads in a room or in a program could have actually had a leveraged effect, and you multiply that by $115. I would do it, but my wife does the math in my house. And that's the kind of impact we can actually have. We actually use those dollars to shift policy. So it's smarter philanthropy. Other questions?
Next steps?
I'm sorry?
What are the next steps?
Next steps. So we continue to workshop the idea and the concept. I was asked by one of our major funders to convene a conversation. That particular institution wasn't in either of the other groups, and they asked for a meeting to talk about this. So I think we set a smaller table with some funders who have particular motivation around this to begin to do some design work and begin to leverage some commitments even outside of this broader conversation.
You can comment on this, but I'm encouraged by the number of conversations that are occurring and that you're being asked and others are being asked to participate in. I think that will get its own momentum as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Nobody has said, I don't know how you get that in the transcript. But, no one has looked at this and said, this is absolutely a non-starter. People have said it's going to be hard. People have said, does this mean we have to redeploy other assets and resources? But folks have said, okay, I think generally people want to be helpful here. Folks have been publicly responsive. And so the critical part is, what does it look like? Where is it housed? And how do we make the investments? Good deal. Thank you very much.
We have one other thing before we ask Reverend Starsky to close us out, and that's we have to approve the minutes of the September 9th meeting. So I need a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Motion. Second. All in favor, please say
wait,
aye.
hold on, sorry.
Everybody can vote on this one? All right. Anything? You want a roll call on the minutes?
Super
Oh,
quick.
sorry, did it move too fast?
Yeah,
Was there an
super quick.
event?
I'm not, I was at that meeting and I'm not listed in the present commissioners, that's all.
Okay, so let the record show to add Commissioner Packnett to the present commissioners. Okay. All right. Thank you all for your patience and for a long but very productive and thoughtful meeting.
Just one other thought. So I know that we had an action item for staff to work with Focus and staff, but are you okay to meet aggressively based on what was put forward? How does that sound to you? I just wanted to hear your response on that, because I know a lot moved quickly today.
Yes, it certainly did. We're still digesting that, and, certainly something that we'll have to take to, I'll have to take to the board tomorrow.
Yep.
So I'll circle back to you tomorrow.
So the next step for you is you need to take this change back to your board to get the green light to know whether this is possible for you to engage with us on. No, that's okay. I'm working from home tomorrow, so that's good timing. Okay. So just wanted to make sure that was okay. Anything else from additional partners that you wanted to say, Community Foundation or to ARC? Okay. All right. Thank you.
It has become our tradition to close our meetings by standing in through a period of centering in silence. So we invite you to stand with us. We thank you for hanging this long with us in this meeting. We thank all of you who have been a part of this process, and we invite you particularly on a day that marks some transition for our state as it relates to issues of equity, inclusion, and diversity with our systems of care for one another that are supported by all of our resources through our taxes. We began the day in great difficulty and trial, and we saw a response from one of our state's largest bodies to the voices of young people. And quite frankly, we are still a state body seeking to respond appropriately to the voices of young people with systemic change. And so perhaps it is appropriate for us to be reflective on the power of that moment this morning, even the difficulty of the community going forward and shaping a way forward in that and in this. And so I invite you to be reflective about that in this centering time of silence. We thank you. We ask